When people south of the wall talk about the Wildlings, they're usually talking about a threat. Raiders, numbers, something to be stopped at the wall. But the term itself is already doing a lot of work, because north of the wall, they don't use it. They call themselves the Free Folk. And that's not just a different label, it changes how they understand everything else. Status, authority, even what it means to belong to a group. You can see the gap immediately in Jon's chapters. The Watch treats them as one thing, a single mass beyond the wall. But the more time Jon spends among them, the harder that idea is to hold on to. So before getting into how they live, it's worth pausing on that difference. Because if you start from the southern view, most of what follows doesn't make much sense. Hello everyone, and welcome to Storyteller's Codex. Here we delve deep into the rich lore of the Lord of the Rings, a song of ice and fire, and the vast worlds beyond. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. When Jon first sees the host gathered under Mance Rayder in a storm of swords, it doesn't feel like a single people. It feels crowded, different groups keeping to themselves, even while sharing the same valley. Fires set apart, different ways of dressing, speaking, organising. You have the Thenns marching in formation, bronze weapons, clear hierarchy under the Magnar. Jon notices immediately that they behave differently from the others. Then you have Tormund's people, louder, less structured, moving more loosely through the camp. Harma Dogshead's followers are there as well, and Jon is told plainly that she hates the people of the Frozen Shore. That tension doesn't disappear just because they're in the same place. There are also the Hornfoot men, who go barefoot even in the cold. The cave dwellers, who rarely come out into the open. The people from the ice rivers, who live in conditions the Watch barely understands. And then there are giants, moving among them as something that feels normal to the people there, even if it doesn't to Jon. At one point he realises that even the language shifts slightly depending on who he's speaking to. So when the Watch talks about the Wildlings, it flattens all of that into one category. But what Jon actually sees is closer to a collection of separate societies that happen to be in the same place at the same time. And that distinction matters because whatever structure exists beyond the wall has to work across those differences, not erase them. When Jon speaks with Mance Rayder, there's a line that gets repeated a lot. The Free Folk do not kneel, but in the books, that isn't presented as a slogan. It comes up in conversation, almost casually, and Jon keeps running into it from different directions. There's no equivalent to the southern structure where you have lords, sworn men, and small folk tied to land. No one is born into a permanent position beneath someone else, in that formal sense. That doesn't mean there's no structure at all. You can see quickly that some people carry more weight than others. Tormund moves through the camp and people listen, not because they have to, but because of who he is, his reputation, his experience, the stories attached to him. Styr with the Thenns is different. There's a clearer chain of command there. His people follow him in a way that looks more disciplined, more consistent. Varamir, in the prologue of A Dance with Dragons, gives you another angle. His authority comes from being a skin changer. People fear him, rely on him, but also keep their distance. It's not loyalty in the southern sense, it's something closer to negotiated power. And then there's Craster. Jon recognises immediately that something is wrong there. Even among the Free Folk, Craster is spoken about differently. He has his own rules, his own territory, and yet he's tolerated, partly out of necessity, partly out of fear, partly because no one wants to deal with what he represents. So there isn't a single system replacing feudal hierarchy. What you get instead is a range of local arrangements, strength, skill, reputation, family, sometimes fear. All of these shape who people listen to, and it changes depending on where you are and who you're dealing with. The first time Jon hears about stealing a wife, it sounds like something simple. Take a woman, run, and that's it. But when Ygritte explains it, it becomes clear there's more going on. She tells him that if you want a woman, you have to take her. Not because force itself is the point, but because it proves something. That you can, that you're willing to risk it, that you can survive the consequences. And then she adds something else. If the woman doesn't want you, she can kill you in your sleep. That part tends to get overlooked, because it changes how the custom works in practice. It isn't a one-sided act that ends the moment it happens. It becomes a relationship that has to hold together afterward. John sees this tension directly in how Ygritte speaks about it. There's expectation, but also agency, even if it's expressed differently from the south. Then you have Craster again, which acts as a kind of boundary case. His wives are his daughters. That isn't treated as normal. Even among the Night's Watch there's disgust. But beyond the wall, it's also clear that Craster is not simply another example of Wildling custom. He's tolerated because of what he provides: shelter, information, a place to pass through. That distinction matters, because it shows that while the free folk have marriage traditions, they're not without limits or judgment. Households form through these customs, through children, through survival, not through formal contracts or alliances between houses, but through arrangements that have to work in practice. And like everything else beyond the wall, those arrangements vary depending on who you're looking at. Religion north of the wall is easy to flatten if you look at it from the south. You'll often hear that they follow the old gods, and that's true, but it doesn't really capture how it works in practice. There are weirwoods beyond the wall. John sees them. Sacred groves exist, and people treat them with a kind of quiet respect. Not formal worship in the way the Faith of the Seven operates, but something older and less structured. And then you get figures like Varamir. In the prologue of A Dance with Dragons, his thoughts make it clear that skin changing isn't just a rare ability. It's something that carries rules, taboos, and consequences. He thinks about the abominations, about what it means to live inside animals, about what happens when a skin changer dies. That's not superstition in the casual sense. It's a belief system tied to how people understand identity and survival. Then there's Craster again. His relationship with the others is not explained, but it's clearly ritualized. He gives his sons to them. The Watch knows it, the Wildlings know it, and yet he continues to exist in that space between fear and necessity. No one treats that as normal, but no one pretends it's meaningless either. And across all of this, there's a sense that the past hasn't disappeared. Stories about the others aren't just dismissed as old tales. They sit closer to lived memory, or something like it. When people move south, it isn't framed as reacting to a legend. It's treated as responding to something real. So religion among the free folk isn't unified. It's part reverence, part fear, part inherited understanding of things that the south has mostly turned into stories. When John first encounters the Thenns, he notices the difference immediately. They move in formation. They follow commands without hesitation. Their weapons are bronze, not scavenged iron or bone. That alone sets them apart. Because forging bronze requires something most of the free folk don't really have: a stable enough system to support craft specialization. You need knowledge passed down, consistent access to materials, and some level of organization, and the Thenns have that. They follow the Magnar, who is treated less like a temporary war leader, and more like a ruler in the southern sense. There's hierarchy there, clearer than anything John sees among the other groups. They also speak the old tongue, not just as fragments, but as a living language within their own society. So when people south of the wall talk about wildlings as if they are all the same, disorganized, primitive, interchangeable, the Thenns don't fit that at all. But they're not an exception in the sense of being completely separate either. They're still part of the free folk. They fight alongside other groups. They join Mance's host. They move south with everyone else. And that creates a problem for the southern view. Because once you acknowledge that one group beyond the wall has structured leadership, metalworking, language continuity, and discipline, it becomes harder to maintain the idea that everything north of the wall exists at the same level. The Thenns don't redefine the free folk. They show that the category itself is too broad to mean very much. Once you move away from battles and large gatherings, the picture changes quite a bit. Most of the free folk are not moving in large groups most of the time. They live in smaller bands shaped by where they are. Along the frozen shore, people rely heavily on the sea, fishing, sealing, whatever they can take from it. John hears about them more than he sees them, but even in the way others speak about them, there's a sense that their lives are built around a different rhythm. Further inland, it shifts again. Tormund's people hunt, move with the seasons, follow game, set up camp, break it down, and move on. There isn't much permanence to it. Then you have the people of the Ice Rivers, who live in conditions that even other wildlings find extreme. John is told about them, and the tone is usually a mix of respect and distance. They're part of the same broader world, but not closely connected. And then there are the giants, They move with mammoths, live in ways that don't really map onto human society at all, but they're still part of the same wider network. They trade, they interact, they fight alongside the others when needed. What ties all of this together isn't a shared economy in the southern sense. There's no central market, no taxation, no organised trade system that runs across all groups. But there is exchange. Furs, meat, tools, knowledge of routes, temporary alliances. Things move between groups even if there isn't a formal system behind it, and occasionally you get something larger. Hardhome is the clearest example. From what we're told, it had a harbour, access to resources, even enough stability for a maester to spend time there studying the free folk. That suggests something closer to a settlement than the usual pattern of movement, which makes its destruction stand out even more, because it shows that under certain conditions something more permanent can form, even if it doesn't last. If there are no lords, no courts, no written laws, then the question becomes fairly simple. What happens when something goes wrong? And the answer, from what we see, is that it depends on who's involved and where it happens. There isn't a single authority that settles disputes across all groups. Instead, it's handled locally. Family, reputation, immediate leadership, those seem to matter more than anything formal. If someone is wronged, it doesn't go to a court. It goes to whoever has the standing to respond. You can see this in smaller interactions, the way people talk about Craster, for example. He's not judged through a system. He's judged through a shared understanding that what he's doing is wrong, even if no one enforces that judgment consistently. Or in Varamir's prologue, where certain acts, like taking another human body, are treated as abominations, not because of written law, but because of what people believe should not be done. Even Ygritte, when she talks about relationships and expectations, frames things in terms of what people accept and what they don't. So there is law of a kind, but it isn't written down, and it isn't applied evenly. It exists as custom, backed by memory, reputation, and the willingness to act on it. And that makes it flexible, but also unstable, depending on the situation, which fits with everything else we've seen beyond the wall. Most of what we've looked at so far works at a small scale. Bands, clans, local customs, local authority, so when something larger appears, it stands out. Hardhome is the clearest example we have before the main story. We're told it had a harbour deep enough for large ships, access to wood and stone, and enough stability that a maester spent years there studying the free folk. That alone suggests something closer to a settlement than the usual pattern of movement, and then it's gone, burned, destroyed, abandoned, and avoided for centuries afterward. Whatever caused that, it leaves behind something useful to think about, that when the free folk concentrate in one place, something changes, the scale shifts, and it doesn't necessarily hold. Then you get Mance Rayder. What he does is different, but it has the same underlying issue. He brings together groups that don't normally stay together, not into a permanent settlement, but into a single movement. Jon sees what that looks like. Not just warriors, but families, animals, entire communities moving at once. And it works for a time. But once that central presence is removed, things start to separate again. Some reach the wall and make their own arrangements, others scatter, others never make it south at all. So whether it's Hardhome or Mance's host, the pattern is similar. Small-scale life works consistently. Large-scale concentration appears under pressure and doesn't last in the same way. By the time you've seen enough of the free folk through Jon's chapters, the southern view starts to look incomplete. They're not a single people. They don't share one structure, one set of customs, or one way of organising themselves. Some groups are highly structured, others aren't. Some hold to older traditions closely, others adapt more freely. Religion, marriage, leadership, survival, all of it shifts depending on where you are and who you're looking at, and that makes them difficult to categorise from the outside. The Night's Watch tends to see them as a constant threat beyond the wall, but that view doesn't really account for how they live, or why they move the way they do. When Mance brings them together, it isn't creating something entirely new. It's working with what's already there, different groups, different customs, and aligning them for a specific moment. Once that moment passes, things return to smaller patterns again. So the free folk are not a kingdom, and they're not chaos either. They sit somewhere in between, in a way that doesn't map neatly onto southern categories, and most of the time the South never really tries to understand that difference. If you're interested in The Lord of the Rings or A Song of Ice and Fire, click one of the links on the screen to dive deeper into the lore. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you next time.